In the previous lecture, we added certain SQL attributes into our model, in this case the post class, which allowed us to establish that, for example, the integer that is going to be playing the ID of the entries that are added into the database is going to be the primary key and is going to auto-increment its values. And we also set the experience to have a maximum length of 250 characters, at least when it comes to inserting this into the database. So our application is 100% ready to start using SQLite in a real way, meaning inserting and reading and updating and deleting and creating tables and everything else. In this lecture, we're going to start by inserting into the database. And for that, we're going to navigate to the new travel page. It is from this page from where the user is going to be inserting into the database. And of course, the first thing that we have to do is to design it. I am going to display the Xamarin Forms previewer so I can know a little bit better what am I designing here. And we're going to need to delete the label that we have currently and add a couple of more things. Now remember that currently all of the pages are going to be inside of the navigation page. So we are going to have a title bar in which we are going to have a back button and to which we can add toolbar items. So that's the first thing that we want to add. A toolbar item that will allow the user to save whatever they are adding from this page. So that's the first thing that we're going to define. Remember that to define toolbar items, we have to access first the toolbar items for the content page. So I am going to define right below the definition of the content page dot toolbar items. And it's inside of this definition where I can define a new toolbar item, and I am going to establish its text. The text is just going to be save. So when the user clicks on this toolbar item, they know that they are supposed to save whatever they are adding from here. And then another thing that I will need is to control the clicked event, to add an event handler. And I'm just going to create a default event handler, and it's of course going to be added to the C# file that we have for this class. As you do this, you may find an exception inside of the Xamarin Forms previewer. This is because SAML still thinks that there is still no event handler called this way, because it has just been added. The solution is to simply head back to the solution, maybe clean it first, and then rebuild it. Now, the next thing that we have to change is inside of the stack layout, we don't really need a label, so we can get rid of it, but what we need is an entry. So right inside of the stack layout, we are still going to keep the stack layout because maybe eventually we add more things. We are to define an entry. And the entry is first going to have a placeholder. And in here, all we want to write is write your experience. We're also going to be needing a name because we want to access this entry from C# code. So remember that this has to be named so it's accessible. And follow the same naming convention that you follow so far. In my case, I want to write experience entry. And right now, I'm not going to be applying any style or anything. I have the basic definition of an entry. Now that we have the entry, it's time for us to insert into the database. This, of course, has to happen when the user clicks on this save toolbar item. So I'm going to save whatever changes I needed to save from the SAML file, and I am going to open the new travel page.xaml.cs file, where I already have this toolbar item underscore clicked event handler. Inserting into a database is fairly straightforward. The first thing that we need is what we are going to be inserting. And in this case, we're going to be inserting posts. We have defined previously a model, inside of the model folder, a post class. Of course, because that is in the different namespace than this file, which is travel record app namespace, we have to add a using directive to that namespace. And we happen to know that that using directive is going to be travel record app.model. And once we have added that using directive, we can use the post class. I am going to define a new post. And as we create elements, we can also define the values that their properties are going to receive with this notation. Right after the new post part, we can add these curly braces and inside start establishing the value for the properties. In this case, we do not want to set the ID. The ID is going to be automatically set by SQLite once we start inserting into the database, because it is already marked as auto increment. what we want to set is the experience. And the experience is going to be equal to whatever is written inside of the experience entry. And so we have what we are going to be inserting into the database. The next thing that we need is a connection to the database. To create a connection to the database, all we have to do is access the SQLite connection class, which is inside of the SQLite namespace. If we do not want to establish the namespace, we can add a using directive to SQLite. And we're going to have to create an object of this type. So I'm going to name this con for connection. And this is going to be equal to a new SQLite connection. Now, the constructor for SQLite connection is going to request where is this database going to be located. And remember that we have that value inside of the app.databaseLocation variable. And so now we have that connection. The next thing that we need is a table where we're going to be inserting. And the table, remember that is going to be represented in C# by the post class. So basically the table that we want to create is called post, and it's going to have as columns the properties inside of this class. So all we have to do is access through the connection variable that we have the create table method. In here we have a create table method that is going to be first requiring the type of the table that is going to be created. We can pass post and we can add the parentheses, and that is it. This notation may be new to you. This is called generics. It's just establishing the type that this method is going to be using when executing. And it's more secure than its not generic counterpart when creating new elements. Now that we have the table, the next thing that we have to do is insert into it. And we can do that as well through the connection variable that we have. And we're going to call the insert method. To the insert method, we have to pass an object. And notice that indeed what we are being asked is an object. And we can pass the post variable. Remember that every single class by default inherits from object. So if we pass any type in here, it is not going to create any errors because every type is an object type. Later on, this insert method is going to get the type for that object, which is going to be post. And that is how it is going to know to which table is it going to be inserting. And that's it. That's pretty much everything that we need to insert into the database. But there is something else that is very important to notice in here. We can only have one connection at a time to the database. This means that every time we set a connection, we also have to close it. And to close a connection, we're going to have to go to the connection and call the close method. If we didn't do this, the next time that we try to create a connection, we will probably get exceptions because there is already one connection established to the same database. So it is very important that you close this connection. Now, there is another thing that I want to do, and that is to evaluate if the insert was successful or not. It turns out that the insert method returns an integer. This integer is going to have the amount of rows that were inserted into the database. So what we can do is define a new integer that is going to be called rows, and that is going to be equal to whatever this insert method returns. And later on, I can evaluate if rows is greater than 0, it means that at least one element got inserted into the database, in which case I can tell the user that the insert was successful. We can do this by sending an alert or displaying an alert into the screen of the phone. Now, we haven't done this so far, but it is very simple to do. It is as easy as calling the display alert method. The display alert method is going to be part of the content page, and in fact any page. So the display alert, notice that it's going to first require the string for the title, then the string for the message, and then the string for the cancel button. So the title is going to be success. We can add a message that is going to be experience successfully inserted, and then a cancel button that will say OK. In the case that no rows were inserted, we can display another alert, which is going to say failure. And so this will allow us to know, without having to read from the database yet, if the insert was successful. So now we can go ahead and test this on any simulator, Android or iOS that we want, because remember that this is going to do pretty much the same thing. and see what alert are we going to be receiving inside of the phone. Once the application is up and running, we can log in. And by the way, I should get rid of that test text that I added to these two entries. We can select login. From this tabbed page, we can select add to navigate to the page that we were just creating. And in here, we can write out some experience or some text that will get saved inside of the database. And so we're going to click on the save button to trigger that event handler that we created. And we are getting a success alert. So we know, or we can assume that right now the element has already been inserted. Because if we head back and I'm going to stop the execution, this is only displayed when at least one row was inserted. So by now we have successfully inserted into the database. In the next lecture, we're going to start reading from the database, so we know that this actually was inserted into it. But up until now, you already know how to create connection to the database. You already know that you have to create a table before being able to insert into the database and then insert an element into that table. You also know that it is important to always close the connection to the database, because otherwise you may find some errors when you try to connect to the same database later. So in the next lecture, we're going to start reading from this same table.